every story there is good and bad. But it's a thin line.
I had been 15 years in Guantanamo without any judge or without any sentence.
I said if I left Guantanamo, I will kill Americans.
9/11. You have two buildings, right?
Yes.
Two building lots. We lost two countries.
But when you see the people jumping from the building, it's not victory. I feel shame about this.
When they arrive to us, society would like to punish him, okay. But how to deal with him after we already punished him?
When I come here, he said, put it your anger for the paper. I said, it's crazy how I put my anger in the paper.
We don't claim that we are 100% successful.
شوفونا هذه ما تعني هاللوحة هذه.
ملتحي عنده شنب في دائرة.
All the people, they asked me, how you go to jihad? Nobody they asked me, why you go?
You see the movies? Fast and Furious? Huh? You wanna do?
This new life. You're not a prisoner, but you are not also free.
You haven't made any friends outside?
No. Someone said he was in Guantanamo. He's a terrorist.
Just give me the something I can live like human. That's it. Job, something like, you know.
شوف أنا يعني ما في لا زواج ولا عندي مستقبل.
I have no future here.
Do you think your life was easier when you were in Afghanistan with Al-Qaeda?
Sometime, yeah.
So you're saying you went from making remote control bombs to remote control car alarms?
Yes.
So many things to talk about, and I have so many questions the second time I've seen the film. And just sort of full disclosure, in the long, strange trip of this film, I was involved in part of it. I wrote an article about it for National Review. It was the only publication that would take my piece. And it was examining how the film was attacked early on by a very small group of people, and whether that had been fair or not. I came to the conclusion it wasn't. But I just feel you should know that I've written about the film, but I'm a neutral observer, and I hope we have a chance to ask questions from the audience as well. Is that part of it? Yeah, good, okay. So I was sort of on the other side from these guys, right? I was with American soldiers. I was with Massoud in the north when he was fighting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in 2000. And then I was with American soldiers and in the Korangal Valley in eastern Afghanistan. And one of them said to me, it was a freezing cold night. We were on this little hilltop. And he said, right over there on that hilltop, there's the Taliban. He said, guys just like us. They're our age, basically the same weapons. I'm sure they're freezing cold as well. They're probably scared of what's going to happen tomorrow, just like we are. It's amazing how similar we are. And I feel, Meg, like you have made a film about, in some ways, you've bridged that gulf that my friend, the soldier, was talking about. Like, look, all those people over there on that hilltop, they're kind of like us too. Different in important ways, but also kind of like us. How did you come to make this film? I mean, can you just walk us through this extraordinary thing? Because it's sort of stunning that this exists.
Yeah, I can do that. Before I do, because I always want to comment on something you said. So actually, a lot of people saw the film during Sundance from the vet community, and we had a lot of them reach out and write emails and things like that. And there was one guy who messaged me, and he said, I would never admit this to anyone, but I miss war. I don't miss the fighting or the shooting, but I missed the sense of brotherhood and camaraderie, and I missed the sense of purpose. And he said, since I've gotten back to the United States, I just haven't found that anywhere until I saw your film. And I saw that same sense of brotherhood and sense of purpose in these men. And for me, it was really just alarming because these were the men that I was sent to kill. And what I realized after watching your film is I had way more in common with the men that I was sent to Afghanistan to go kill than the people who actually sent me there in the first place. And he was saying that when he watched the film, he found it very healing because, as Sebastian said, you know, the Brendan, he watched it and he kind of said, you know, I always wondered what they were like, and this kind of confirmed it. And so, yeah, I think that for me has been one of the really positive things to come from this. And but you were asking how I got access. I'll give you the Cliff Note version. So
and how did you think of it? I mean, just if you could just sort of quickly, like, walk us through how this wound up in your life, or vice versa.
Yeah, so I wasn't always a filmmaker. I think a lot of you know from the Sam Harris podcast, I used to be a firefighter. And if you asked me back then what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, without hesitation, I would have said be a firefighter. But then something happened on 9/11. I was at the firehouse, and almost overnight, you know, before 9/11, my firehouse was a place of love and support and family. And then the day after, it became a place of hatred and rage and bigotry. And nothing that I saw on mainstream media answered any of those questions that were like generated from that day. And so for me, when I don't understand something, I just do a deep dive in research. So I started reading books about Islam and the history of the Middle East. I started watching a lot of news and documentaries. And what I realized is that each one of those sources, the articles and the news, I was getting information through someone else's filter. Because those two pieces of sources were directly contradicting each other. The books I read about Islam said that, you know, you can't kill an innocent person. But then I watched the news and it said this is a violent religion. So I really didn't know who to believe. And so I thought like the only way that I could actually understand was to remove the filter. And the only way that I could think about that was to go to Afghanistan on my own and try to find those answers for myself. So a little bit over 6 months after Afghanistan, after 9/11, I went to Afghanistan, and
You're all of 20 or something.
I was
right?
21 at the time.
Oh, 21.
I was an old soul at 21. And so when I got to Afghanistan, I mean, I don't know, do you guys remember what you were like when you were 21? Because I thought I knew everything. I think that might be just an affliction of being in your early 20s. But when I landed in Afghanistan, I was kind of immediately humbled by my own ignorance of the world. And that kind of set me on this journey to try to educate myself and see the world through other cultures and religions and places. And so shortly, about a year or so after that, I left the fire service and I moved to Yemen, where I studied Arabic and Islamic culture, and I was there for almost half a decade. And when I was there, I was working as a firefighter instructor for Yemeni men. And one day I was on the fire ground and I overheard a conversation. And they were talking about a terrorist attack. I think this is back in 2007. They were talking about a terrorist attack that in Saudi Arabia, and the perpetrators had been caught. And half the perpetrators, they said, were Saudi, and the other half were Yemeni. And the Yemenis, according to them, were tortured and then killed. And the Saudis were sent to something that they referred to as jihad rehab. And at the time, I wasn't a filmmaker, but I also knew enough to know that Saudi Arabia was not known at that time, or now, for its human rights record or for being progressive. So I was like, why is the most conservative country in the world running a terrorist rehab program? And it always kind of stuck with me. And then years later, when I switched, professions and became a documentary filmmaker, this seemed to be a good subject to pick, but I didn't realize it was gonna be this hard. It was like a year to get access, and then 3 years of filming, 2 years of editing, and a year of being blacklisted. So altogether, it's been quite a while.
I mean, I could have many questions about how you pulled this off, because the Saudi state and the Saudi bureaucracy, particularly around national security concerns, just would seem like a completely impossible thing and frustrating thing to deal with. I think I'm going to move on a little bit. We can circle back to that. I mean, there's so much stuff to talk about. One of the things that struck me is that one of the guys said that he joined Al Qaeda for excitement, right? Because he wanted to fight. Another guy said he needed to be paid. He needed money. He was a kid. He needed money. The American soldiers that I know, if you ask them, so why'd you join the army and go to Afghanistan? Like, those might be two of the most popular answers, right? And it sort of strikes me like the similarity of young people, particularly young men. Like, there's this thing you can go off and do. So like a certain kind of young guy goes off and does it. And did that strike you while you're doing this? Have other veterans seen this and sort of commented on the similarities in that way, like the motivations?
Yeah, like a lot of the vets who reached out kind of actually echoed what you just said. But so over the course of making the film, in the beginning, I interviewed over 150 of these guys, between 150 and 200. And of those 150, only 30 were interested in the project. And of those 30, only 12 wanted to do the film without any kind of blurring of the face or disguise. And for me, it was really important to have the audience be able to look these men in the eyes, because that's where we find our humanity. That's where we find our connection with other human beings. And so, to your point, after talking to over 150 of these men, I began to see a pattern. And that was that they would fall into one of 4 different categories. Not all, there were exceptions, but most of them would fall into one of 4 categories in terms of the motivation and why they got into these groups. The first one, which I think all Americans are mostly familiar with, is the cause, right? So that would be Abu Ghanem. He saw Muslims in Bosnia being persecuted and oppressed, and so he wanted to go there to defend his fellow Muslims, and that was his religious duty. But the other 3 have absolutely nothing to do with religion. And they are, the second one is economic necessity, which is Nader. He said, things were hard before. You want money, you need money, you go to jihad. And that's like what was his motivation, was he needed a job, he needed money, he needed work. And the next one, the third one, is peer pressure. So that was Ali, where his brother was into this, his family was into this. And the last one, the fourth one, which is more age dependent, more the younger guys, is sense of adventure. And that was Muhammad, right? So he said, I didn't want to go to school, I didn't want to work, and so this guy offered me a free ticket to Afghanistan to shoot rockets. I was 19, why not? I thought it was very telling what he said in the film, because I asked him if he would ever go back to this life, and he said jihad is for teenagers, because in his mind, for his motivation, this is something you do when you're young, and he grew out of it, according to him. So what I would say is, when I talk to a lot of my vet friends, they say the same thing. In terms of, I have a lot of friends who joined up after 9/11, the cause. A lot of friends who are like me, who don't have loads of money, and so they need, money to help them go to school, right? For university, economic necessity. I have friends who come from military families, and that's just what they do, peer pressure. And the last one, obviously, people who don't have a lot of money, can't travel the world. A lot of people join the military to be able to have those experiences. So what I realized after talking to a lot of these men is it was never about good and evil, is about time and circumstance, and how time and circumstance can determine the trajectory of a young person's life.
Was there a moment during filming where you realized, like, oh my God, this is different from what I expected? This is a whole new way of thinking about things, has just opened up to me that I hadn't occurred to me before. Like, was there a sort of light bulb moment like that?
Every fucking day.
Every day. Yeah.
I think the first time that it really hit me was the first time I met Nader. So like I said, I talked to a bunch of these guys, but Nader was the one that I clicked with the first, and we got really close really fast. Because, so when you're a firefighter, you see a lot of horrific stuff, right? Like burnt bodies, domestic abuse. And over a long period of time, that really takes its toll. And so you have to find a way to process it, right? To decompress, to be able to move on and continue on with your job. And how firefighters, or at least the ones I used to work with, chose to do that was through humor. And this is not the kind of like knock knock joke humor. This is like really dark, politically incorrect humor that in probably any other profession would get you fired. But in that job, it was kind of a necessity just to get through the day. And I had never really seen that kind of humor with exception of one other profession, which was military folks who'd seen combat. Until that is, I met Nader. And the first time I met Nader, and we sat down one-on-one, he would tell me stories about Guantanamo, horrific stories about things that were done to him. But he did this all with a smile on his face and through bouts of uncontrolled laughter and through really, really, really dark jokes. And everyone else in that room that was there, you know, thought that he was some kind of psychopath or that he was lying. But I knew better. Not because I had some kind of crystal ball, but I knew that he was telling the same kind of jokes that my firefighter buddies told me. And so that meant that he was just going through the shit. He was still processing it. He was still trying to decompress. And we kind of found that immediate bond, but through our shared love of inappropriate humor. And he would tell a joke, then I would tell a joke, and we just kind of made each other laugh. And it was really interesting because what I think about like humans and our humanity, we're such complex individuals that we can find connection and understanding to people that on paper would be our complete opposite, right? So Nader's a 44-year-old Muslim, Arab, Yemeni man who was a member of Al-Qaeda. At the time, I was a 36-year-old American, Californian ex-firefighter. On paper, we had nothing in common. But like humans are like more than just, you know, the boxes you would check on some census, right? And I'm sure you have friends that on paper, probably you're like, we have nothing in common, but you can find those connections with fellow human beings. And in terms of like the guys and your original question was, I forgot really quick because I went on a long tangent like I normally do.
Oh, was there a moment where the sort of door opened?
So in those first meetings with the guys and Nader, like I realized like we were just having a laugh, and it was really interesting because the national narrative of the U.S. is these men are all psychopaths, and this is a violent religion, and they hate us, and they're just bloodthirsty, crazy people. But meeting them, hearing their stories, spending 3 years with them, like that just kind of, for me, I realized that there's what you see in the headlines, and then there's the complexity and nuance and the realness of real life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. For me, one of the most powerful moments of the film were when two different men sort of acknowledged the horror of 9/11. You know, basically that's no victory. And one of them said, I felt a great shame, something like that, which for me as an American was sort of a relief to hear. I was like, oh my God, so you get it also, like what a horror that was. But it reminded me of an American soldier, Brenda, that I know. And I interviewed him. I made a couple of films about the American platoon in Afghanistan. And at one point, Brendan's still a close friend, and he's very, very honest. And he you know, he was an incredibly enthusiastic soldier. He was a great soldier. He loved fighting, right? I mean, I don't, you know, like don't think that like any of what happened over there he didn't like, right? But later he said to me, back in the U.S., he said to me, you know, I have these thoughts, like we killed people over there, and he said I wouldn't have done it any different, right? If I had to go back, I'd do it exactly the same, except I have this thought, what's God going to think? What's God going to think of what we did? And he's like, and I would have done it again. I would do it again if I had to, no problem. But what is God going to think? And it reminded me very much of those moments in your film. Is that just me, or do you feel that those are two very, very crucial moments in the film that you made?
Yeah, I think the one with Khalid, who was the bomb maker, it was really interesting because we had obviously this is a short movie, so we had to truncate some of the interview, but because his interview was 10 hours long, which I've never done a 10-hour interview before. That was a pretty interesting one. So he said a couple things happened that kind of changed his trajectory. The first one was actually before he went to Guantanamo, when America started bombarding the U.S. and they were all in Tora Bora, and Khalid was with Osama bin Laden. And Osama bin Laden told his men to go back to their home countries and regroup. And Khalid felt betrayed because he said, you told us to come here. You told us that we were fighting a holy war and that we were doing right in the world, and now as soon as this starts, you're leaving, you're abandoning us. So that was the first time where he started to question it. But then, like Nader said, they didn't have television, they had radio. So none of the guys had seen the footage before they went to Guantanamo. And so when Khalid was in Guantanamo and he saw these civilians jumping from the building, he was just like, he said to me, he's like, it was the first time I realized that I was on the wrong side of this. And the same thing with Nader, where, Nader kind of he starts out the movie, right, and looking back at his days with the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, is like with nostalgia, like the good old days. And then he ends the movie looking back at that same period of time with like resentment, right? I've been doing this for 20 years, and what do I have to show for it? And then he's in the pool where he's talking about reflecting on 9/11, reflecting on like being young and going to these places and doing this stuff. And he's like, I just never considered the consequences, which when you're that age, you don't. Yeah.
I remember when 9/11 happened, I was overseas. I was in the country of Moldova, very, very poor country, on assignment. And people were telling me something happened in your country. And I got to a television, and it was French. They were airing French television, which was less censored than here, or less tasteful, however you want to think of it. And it showed people jumping from the towers. And I had just said that I threw up. My body just had this visceral reaction. And it took me a while to get home from there. And I still think about 9/11 and just this feeling of, I'm still 20 years later, filled with this feeling of horror and rage about what happened. But then I hear the accounts of torture at Guantanamo. Of course, we all know about that. We've read about it. And I feel an incredible shame. I mean, I feel the equivalent shame to what Khalid said about 9/11, right? I mean, I was like, oh my God, this is this country that I love, and we did this. Like, we chose to do this. And a great shame, a great pain and revulsion about that. And so I'm so sorry, it was a long setup, but my question is, do you recognize those feelings in yourself? And how did you navigate those two sort of moral poles, the two emotional poles? How did you navigate those and integrate them? I mean, even just personally, and much less in the film, just personally, like how do you do that? It's hard.
I think for me, it's definitely the hardest film I've ever made for a plethora of reasons, but it's probably the hardest thing I've ever done. And one of those reasons is, I was a firefighter for, over 5-6 years. And firefighting is not like a normal job. Like, those people are your family. You eat together, you sleep together, but sleep in the same room together. But don't want that going up online out of context. And you just become family. And so when 9/11 happened, and 344 firefighters died, and I knew a couple of people who still work for FDNY, and we talk every once in a while. I saw my country as a victim. But then when I moved to Yemen, and I lived there for so long, and I saw what my country was doing in the region, I then saw my country as the perpetrator. And so I kind of had one foot in each camp, and I felt consistently pulled back and forth because, like you said, I would hear stories about someone like Abu Ghanem talking about being sexually assaulted, and other men I talked to as well. Not everyone, but a handful of them had a similar story. And I was like, my government sanctioned sexual assault to interrogate people. And I had that feeling of like, shame. But then I'd hear someone like Nader saying like, what's the big deal? 2 buildings fell down. Just build more. They're buildings. And so it was constantly a pull of back and forth because I've had those very different experiences in those 2 different worlds. But also I think for me, that made the editing of the film, it made me be a lot more thoughtful about how I approached every scene. Right? I thought about people that I consider like family who live in Yemen, or some of my family that were in Yemen now live in the United States, but what they would think of it. But I also would think about what my firefighter friends think about this. Like, I don't know if that makes sense.
Have any of your firefighter friends seen this?
Yes.
And I'm curious. Like, what did they say?
I think the exact quotes was like, "Smaker, you just love to stir shit, don't you?" Some things never change.
That's great.
But yeah.
So, of course, there's a long and wonderful tradition of outsiders making films about topics, about people. Barbara Koppel made an amazing film about coal miners in Kentucky. I was an outsider with the U.S. military. I wasn't a soldier. I was a journalist. And I made a film called Restrepo that a lot of soldiers really liked, even though I was not one of their own, right? You obviously are not an Arab man, and
not last time I checked.
Not
no.
last time you checked. And so I would, and we can go into the controversy or not that the film sort of weirdly sparked. But at the core of some of the conversation around the film was the question of authorship and who has the right to tell stories. And personally, I think everyone has the right to tell a good and honest story about anything that they it's nice to hear applause on that. Thank you. But I'm wondering, Meg, what do you outsiders bring an asset to a story, and they bring limitations. And I'm just sort of wondering, like, for you personally with this story, like, how, walk us through that. Were there limitations that you were aware of, you tried to sort of struggle against, and what were the assets you brought to the story as well as an outsider?
Yeah, I think one of the big limitations for me is there is I lived in Yemen for a really long time, and so I think I had a lot of more cultural awareness than maybe your average American. However, nothing is going to replace local knowledge. And part of being a journalist, part of being a filmmaker is doing a little self-assessment and saying, like, okay, where are my holes? So, for example, I'd lived in Yemen, but I never lived in Saudi. I had a pretty good idea about Saudi Arabia, but not the kind of nuanced, complex understanding that one would need to pull something like this off. So one of my co-producers is Saudi, and they were giving me advice about trying to navigate this very complex world. Not just like filming, but more so like how to maintain access, right? Because the hardest thing about this, it was hard to get access, but it was really hard to maintain it throughout 3 years. And then I remember one time I gave them a look at one of the rough cuts, and they said to me, they're like, Habibati, you should know better than this. Why are you opening your film with a shot of the desert and a Dostoevsky quote? I was like, yeah, good point. You need someone to be able to be honest with you. And so we'd have long conversations, and it's something of being very humble about your limits, right? But then also realizing what your strengths are. So my strengths when it came to these men were my time in Yemen, my knowledge of Yemen, and being able to have that connection that way. And they're trusting me to tell their stories, where other people who didn't have that experience, they definitely would not have done that. So yeah, that makes sense.
So I don't know what our time limit is in this room. I feel like maybe we can
open it up.
Open it up.
Yeah, sure.
Questions. I'll let you call the questions and answer them.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, it's you.
Okay, first of all, I want to tell you this is possibly the most extraordinary documentary I've ever seen.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. If you know any Academy voters, please tell them.
Exactly. It's just, it's left there with so much to think about. I have two questions that are kind of like the elephant in the room, maybe. And one of them is, I know you had a lot of footage to sort through.
Yeah.
So, were there any more conversations about Bin Laden, like what it was like to be his bodyguard, or how they felt when he was finally, nabbed, or any of those kind of things? That's one question that I have. And the other was, were you actually in hijab while you were interviewing them, or how was the day-to-day?
Did you see the picture of me in the film? Did you catch that? So in the pool scene, where the camera's flipped around, you see this very amazing looking woman in the background. That's me. Yeah, I look different when I'm all, yeah. Well, Well, no, on a side note, here's what I'll tell you. I don't know. Have any of you been to the Middle East? Okay. So have you ever had to wear an abaya and a hijab? Right? So when you're moving around all the time, so for example, abayas in Saudi Arabia are really loose fitting. And so anytime I would pull up my hands to film, it would fall down and I would show my elbows, which in a place like the center is like, I'm just flashing them my tits. It's the equivalent of that. And so and another problem was I'd be filming with both my hands on the camera and my hijab would fall down. And I had to put my camera down and redo that and I'd miss stuff. And then another problem was abayas usually have buttons on them or snaps. And when I walk upstairs are really long and I might step on it and then it would pull and rip the whole thing open. So I was constantly like fucking around with this thing and I'm like, I gotta figure out how to do this better. So I designed a production abaya where I had elastic and had it made. I had elastic in the wrist piece so it wouldn't fall down. And then I added a hood so that I can keep on filming. So if my hijab fell down, I would just put up a hood. And then I made it a zipper. So if anyone wants to go film in the Middle East, I have good design for an abaya. So what was the other question? Sorry. Oh yeah, so Khalid was with Bin Laden, and like I said, his interview was 10 hours long. And someday I hope to be able to find the funding or a partner to make his interview into a podcast, because if you think this film is mind-blowing, like Khalid's story is just insane. And he talks a lot about his experiences with Bin Laden, some of their conversations. And he has a lot of really interesting memories and anecdotes and story about him that didn't make the film. But yeah.
Meg, before you take the next question, I just remembered you told me a story about movies that they had seen, like they knew how Americans fought because they'd watched movies, something like that. Can you just talk about the like?
Yeah. So do you remember the line in the film where Nader goes, "I ain't got no job, I ain't got no money"? That's from the movie Friday. They watched the movie Friday in Guantanamo, and he was quoting this very famous American film. He goes, "I ain't got no job, I ain't got nothing to do," and so I thought it was really interesting. And so all the men in the film, with the exception of Abu Ghanem, speak English, but none of them knew English except for Khalid before they went to Guantanamo. And so they learned it there. So my favorite scene that we had to cut, well, I have a bunch of scenes we had to cut that I loved, but one of my favorite ones is the story of how Ali learned English. So like he said, when Ali went to Guantanamo, he was only 16 years old. He was a kid. And during the Bush administration, they weren't allowed any TV, any nothing, like no contact with family. When Obama came in, he changed that. So they had access to TV. And Ali told me the story of how he learned to play Grand Theft Auto. Now how he learned English through playing Grand Theft Auto. One of the guards kind of took pity on him and was like, "Hey man, like you're a kid, you need to play video games, you need to do something." And so Ali was just like, I don't know, like what video games should I ask for? Like what should I do? And he's like, you should ask for Grand Theft Auto. So then he asked for it, he gets it. And I guess I've never played it, but I guess there's missions that come up and he would pause it and then he would translate those missions, and that's how he learned English. So when I first met Ali, his English was we needed to do some adjustments because apparently the language in Grand Theft Auto is not so nice. And I think that those kind of stories were interesting to me because nothing is all one thing. Guantanamo was a horrific place, but they also tell stories about lawyers and guards that they actually became friends with. And there was horrible guards there, but there also was very nice guards there. And so I feel like one thing I like about that story is it's this idea that they know way more about us than we know about them. And just i.e. Ali's two favorite TV shows were Monk and 2.5 Men. He loved Charlie on 2.5 Men. So, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, let me just say how grateful I am to be here. When I read the article in the Times weeks back, I didn't think any of us would get a chance to see this. I'm going to go to the real elephant in the room. First of all, when I watch this film, every few seconds I go, how can we be sitting here in America in 2022 and you're self-funding a film that not just people interested in film should see, but world leaders in the whole world should see. People should be around the block. This is almost like an underground screening. And it's ironic that, as hard as it was, as Sebastian says, filming in a totalitarian regime like Saudi Arabia, everything would be harder to get your film released in a supposedly democratic country.
No.
And I have to say, so to ask you, because we've heard the crap that, you know, you're a white woman, you have a right to tell the story. That's what some people say. And then other people write, well, that's not it. It's the, you know, forced interrogation. And you've both broken all that down and dissected that and refuted all that. So what possibly else could there be that, you know, and you hear Sundance and these places, they always throw the words around diversity, inclusion, equity, representation, which is bullshit when they disavow you. And when no other film festival except Ohio and one other will take this, and these streaming services that talk about diversity and all that. So, and as you said, you've been blacklisted. So can you speak to that, where we're at in this country, where this is where we're at, and why do you think, is it those reasons, or is there something else why you're having such a hard time getting this film seen, which everybody should see?
Trying to think how to answer that in the most pithy way possible, which you all know I'm not very good at doing. Here's what I would say. I think something has dramatically shifted in our country. And what I mean by that is this. What was it, 30 years ago, Salman Rushdie had that fatwa put on him? Was that about it? 1998. Someone knows. Someone smarter than me in the room. Thank you. And, you know, I remember reading that one of his translators who translated the book was murdered. And bookstores still chose to put the book on the shelf and make it available for the public out of principle. Fast forward 30 years, and you have a handful of people on Twitter who organize an attack on a film and call out Sundance on Twitter and call out Abigail Disney on Twitter and these other organizations. And just through that, they capitulate. And Sundance issued not one, but 2 apologies. And Abigail Disney apologized, and Gotham apologized. And for me, something has drastically changed between 30 years ago and today. If you have these institutions who are supposed to be leaders in our industry, and these people who are supposed to be leaders in our industry, basically bending the knee through social pressure. Because here's what I learned in the fire service. When you are a leader, it is your job to take the hit. And when you are a leading organization and someone is attacking a filmmaker that you claim to support independent filmmakers, and your first instinct is to throw that filmmaker and their film under the bus, you are no longer a leader. And even though it sucks to have that happen to you, part of the responsibility of being in that position is taking the hit. And so what was really, really an eye-opener for me is that I looked up to these institutions. I looked up to these people. Because at the end of the day, I am like a nobody in my industry. This is my first, I mean, not my first documentary, but my first feature-length documentary. And, you know, I'm the new kid on the block. I don't have the clout that Sundance has. I don't have the resources that Abigail Disney has. But like I said, like I heard this quote somewhere, you know, when the only thing more dangerous than someone with limitless resources and more money than God is someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. And at that point, like in the whole trajectory of this film, I had fuck all to lose. I didn't have a career, I didn't have a film. Most of my friends in the industry weren't even talking to me. So for me, the only thing I had left was the truth and my integrity. And so those are the 2 things that I just held on to. And here we are today.
I should say, if you guys are curious about the details of all this, there was an excellent article in the New York Times in August.
September.
Okay, September. I wrote something in National Review, and then there was a very, very good article in The Atlantic by Graham Wood.
Yeah.
You read those 3, you will really get like the nitty gritty of what happened and really how really incredibly outrageous it was.
Yeah. Well, that was a really assertive hand, so I'm gonna go with you. That was just like I got questions.
I love how disturbing your film is. But the main question I have, like, why, with all people going through the same thing, what was it about these particular people who decided to do what they did? In other words, there are people who are poor. There are people who have a lust for adventure, but they don't. Well, what's the difference between these people and the people that don't? Any argument can be made like I don't want to make a speech, but World War II. Well, I'm in Germany. Well, I need money, so I join the army. What about these people?
Yeah, I think I would say that it's very. Yeah. I think that what I would say is, again, I don't know the answer for that for everyone, but I would say that we're all really, really unique, and we can all come from similar backgrounds, but just respond and make different decisions. For example, I live in Oakland, and there used to be a really strong, gang presence up there, and you could be in a situation where you join a gang, or you can be in a situation maybe where you go and you join a basketball team, but you want to belong to something. You want to feel that you belong to something. And that choice is so nuanced, and it comes down to the individual, where we can all, again, like what's really interesting about the film is you have men on paper who are identical, all Yemeni, all spent 15 years in Guantanamo, all spent almost 2 years in the rehab center, and all got involved with this group around the same age. On paper, identical. But you see the end of the movie, and they all land in very, very different places. Because it comes down to, you can't say, okay, they're all like this, and so they're all going to respond the same way. And I feel like one of the reasons, someone saw an earlier cut, and they're like, why do you have so many characters? Just pick one. Because it's a complex issue. If I just picked one character, you'd say, well, they're all like this. No fucking group is all like anything, right? The Muslim community is not a monolith. There's going to be people who love this film. There's going to be people who hate this film. Filmmakers are not a monolith. Nothing's a monolith. And so you can't really say that, like, these people all did this or these people didn't do this. Why? It really comes down to the individual. It's been my experience. But I could be wrong. It's happened once before. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just add, just to sort of clarify for people, and this is something I've written about a little bit, that there were sort of Al-Qaeda prime that was focused on attacking overseas and attacking this country. And then there were Al-Qaeda foot soldiers that were in Afghanistan, in Bosnia. They weren't trying to bomb New York City, right? I mean, they in their mind, they had organized the sort of reason of, well, Muslims are oppressed in Bosnia. And, they were very principled people, Westerners, who went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War. My dad grew up in Spain and fled the Civil War when he was 13. There were very principled people from England, from America, that went to Spain to fight the fascists for reasons of principle, because they felt that good people were being killed and oppressed. Did they want excitement and know what combat was like? Probably some of them did, right? They were young guys, and they want, whatever, like, who knows, personally. But there was also a reason that felt noble to them. And one of the things your film did was sort of make it a little bit more clear to me, like, if you were a non-affluent Muslim man in Yemen or Saudi Arabia, and you looked at what was happening in Bosnia, which was my first war that I covered, and you looked at what was happening, or what you were told was happening in Afghanistan. I mean, I hated the Taliban regime, but I sort of understand the logic, like, we're trying to establish an Islamic country in Afghanistan. The world doesn't want us to. We're going to go make it happen. I kind of get it, right? So you just have to understand that, like, that worldview is as fully formed and as convincing to them as was the worldview that sent people to Spain in 1936 to fight the fascists.
Yeah, and I want to say something that you said, no affluent. I would say even affluent. So Khalid comes from a very well-off family, the bomb maker, and he is college educated, and he wasn't like Nader. So again, back to your point, like, you can be poor, rich, poor, educated, uneducated, from Yemen, from the UK, it really just comes down to the individual and the kind of choices and the time and the circumstance that they're exposed to, if that makes sense. Yeah, we'll do. I'm trying. I'll go all the way in the back with the mask. Yeah, and the beanie, the mask and the beanie. There you go.
Hi. Thank you for your bravery in making this film. I think there were probably some really hard moments. Just not some, probably a lot. So thank you. And that's actually my question. I wanted to know if there were any moments where you felt in danger, or especially as a woman, you know, coming into that culture and like with all the men, like, are there any specific moments or stories you'd be willing to share with us about where you really had to dig into your courage and bravery and your reason for why you wanted to make this film and keep going?
I think during the year that I lost access, that was probably the hardest one. But I will say that like I think a lot of people assume that me making this film as a woman was harder, and I will say this without a shadow of a doubt. There is no way any man could have made this exact film. No. I say that because those of you who've been to the Middle East know that it's places like Saudi Arabia and Yemen are very segregated. So you have the men's section and the women's section, and men can only go to the men's section and women can only go to the women's section, and they cannot cross like in the wedding that you saw. But in places like Saudi and Yemen, there's a third sex, and that is foreign women who are not Muslim. And they're treated as a third sex, meaning I can go and I can hang out with these guys and film with them. But then I can also go and talk to their wives and their mothers. And talking to someone's mother is where you get all the really good info and understanding about who these men are and how they came to be. And for me, being able to have that access to both places, and also, you know, if we're being completely honest, like, can you stand up? So Sebastian is a big guy, right? big guy. But like these guys, you go ahead and sit down. These guys who were in Guantanamo for 15 years were tortured by people who look like him. So he's a threat. A man like that walks in the room and wanting to talk to them, he's a threat. But I walk in and I'm more of a curiosity than a threat. A 6 foot tall, blonde woman speaking Yemeni Arabic, it's more just what? And I think that because of those serendipitous coincidences, like they're from Yemen, and I lived there for so long, that we were able to have this kind of immediate rapport. And also the fact that I will say, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised by this, at no time in Saudi Arabia did anyone ever tell me I could not film something. They said you can't film this thing during like in a mosque during prayer time as a woman. So I was like, but can I have my male cinematographer go in and I'll have my director's monitor and a walkie-talkie? He's like, yeah, sure. So, but there's nothing that said you can't do this because you're a woman in Saudi. And I want to be completely transparent about that. It was hard to film in Saudi Arabia. It's definitely not easy. But when I was in the States, I had multiple people, potential investors, gatekeepers, tell me there's absolutely no fucking way I could pull off this film as a woman. I would never get the access. I didn't know what I was doing. There was one, I'm gonna have to like call you out on this. There was one potential investor that I had a meeting with, and I told him my background, and I told him I spoke Arabic. And my Arabic now is really rusty and bad, but and he's like, this is a great idea for a film. I love it, but I just don't see you pulling it off. Maybe if you had a co-director like a Sebastian Junger or an Alex Gibney, maybe I can get behind this film. And so I started speaking Arabic to him. He says, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. I was like, yeah, because I speak Arabic, which the two directors that you just named don't. I also lived in the Middle East for over half a decade, which the two directors you just named don't. So if you think that they're better qualified to tell this story than me, we should end this meeting right now, because clearly you have bad judgment, and I don't like to work with people with bad judgment. I did not get the money. But I think, and this is something that I've learned through this process, like I think it's important, you're gonna have a lot of doors slammed in your face when you are genuinely and authentically truthful with people and genuine with people. And I do think that if you're over the age of 25, you've lived long enough where you can tell, no matter what your country you are from, what religion, what language, you know when someone's being genuine and being sincere with you. And for me, saying things like that and being in those situations, it kind of was a filter for me to have people on this project. I am a very principled person, and I have found that not everyone in my industry is. And so it's been kind of a wake-up call. But I will say that I think being truthful and authentically myself at all times has been hard at moments, especially this last year. But I also feel like it's also been an opportunity to meet people like you, right? And I think you're probably one of the most principled people I've met in this industry by far. So it's been interesting. We'll have time for like 2 more questions. Oh, we got lots. Lady with the mask. That's a good question. I will give you the pithiest answer possible. So the original title, Jihad Rehab, was number one. It's what these places are called. So this was the first center of its kind. Now they're in 15 other countries, and colloquially, like the BBC and NPR, refer to these places as Jihad Rehab centers or Jihad Rehab programs. It's also what the men, when I first heard about the center, referred to it as. But when the film was announced at Sundance, which is about almost 2 months before anyone saw it, they had the title, the synopsis, and my bio on there, and all three of those were attacked, because that was the only thing you could attack, because that was the only thing that was online. And so the title then became this weaponized thing. And when we were coming up with the title, I think like everything in the film, we always wanted to do a gut check. So we worked with 2 Islamic scholars and an imam on the film. We also did probably about 30 test screenings while we were editing before Sundance. And we would ask people about the title, and we asked the Islamic scholars about the title and the imam, and they all said the same thing. Like, yeah, when you watch the movie, it makes perfect sense. But here's what I didn't consider. This is where I messed up. I always asked people about the title after they saw the film. I didn't ask anyone who hadn't seen the film. And the reason why that became problematic is because once they weaponized the title, it made it seem that what the film was saying is you need to rehabilitate jihad itself, which is not what the film is saying. And so because of the confusion, and I also talked to this reporter and critic at the LA Times who is Muslim and was the first one to actually write about the film in February. And she was attacked on Twitter, and she defended the film, saying, I'm a Muslim and I love this film. But she goes to me, she's like, Meg, you made a very nuanced and very complex film. The title does not represent the film in terms of its complexity and nuance. I was like, I think you might be right. And so I switched it to the UnRedacted for 2 reasons. I like double entendres, and so these men, we've talked about them for 20 years, but we've never talked with them. So this film was an unredacting of their stories. Also, the film itself was blacklisted. So this is an unredacting of the film. So that's why we changed the title too. So yeah, yes, over there, with the glasses. Oh, you had a question? Oh, go ahead.
I want to, there's so many things that you said that are so important, but one thing I'd like to explore a little bit more with you. You said that at first you saw my country as a victim, and now you see it as a perpetrator.
No. I said when I was a firefighter at 9/11, I saw it as a victim, and then when I went to Yemen, I saw us as a perpetrator. Yeah.
I would like to, living in this country, which has committed so many towering crimes around the world. I guess it's just one example of 9/11. I had a friend who had his best friend died at 9/11, and he organized other artists to have signs up at Times Square that said, "Our grief is not a cry for war." And as abominable as the Trade Center attack was, what happened in Iraq after that, in terms of body counts and everything else, dwarfed that.
Yeah, one thing,
And I just wanted you to, I think it was really an important point. I'd like you to kind of.
No, one of my favorite lines in the film is when Nodder goes to his cousin's house on furlough, and they're smoking hookah. I'm talking to his cousin, because the football's on at that time, so Nodder's just looking straight ahead at watching football, because he's a huge football fan. And he literally just sent me a message the other day, because he went Saudi Arabia won with all these emojis of like, yeah! So, yeah, and I the line that his cousin says, which I thought was really poignant, was, you know, we took 2 billions from you, but you took 2 countries from us. And that sat with me for a long time, because that really hit home, because I remember studying World War II when I was in high school, and the whole idea of 6 million human beings being murdered is something that my little human brain could not really wrap my head around. But then, I read the book Anne Frank. And that was just one person's story, one person's experience. And as a human, I could actually connect with that emotional journey. And the war on terror has hundreds of thousands of people have died. And the knock-on effect has been just devastating. And my little human brain cannot wrap my mind around that. And my hope with this film is, I know it's about 4 men and a very small piece of this whole thing, and it's just this microcosm of their stories. My hope is, it's like, this is that human connection that's missing, and that helps people kind of understand and illuminate the macro story of these last 20 years. So I don't know if that makes sense or not. Yes, because that was just a flick, and I like the flick.
So I have two questions, not really questions, but observations. One is, so you went through the 4 reasons why, you felt like these men joined, jihad. What about, because I see it as like, especially raising kids, raising teenagers, they all want a sense of belonging, to belong to something. And so in that vein, and then you're saying that they have 15 of these facilities now?
Yeah, so 15 different countries have them. So there's one I think there's one in Oman, Singapore, Denmark has one. They have a lot, and a lot of delegations were sent to the Saudi center to study it. The Obama administration sent a lot of delegations to Saudi to study the rehab center.
So I'm wondering if the fact that these teenagers, these young kids, young adults, are joining because they, for the reasons you said, plus for a sense of belonging, why don't is there a way for them at a young age, before they reach that point where they're getting recruited, to somehow have these kids feel a sense of belonging in some way, shape, or form, using...
I mean, here's what I'll say to that. I don't know. I don't know at all. I'm definitely not an expert on teenage psychology and development, so I don't want to speak to that. I also remember what I was like as a teenager, and God help me back. Here's what I will say. I was very fortunate, because I was not a good teenager at all. My dad calls it the dark years to this day. And I was very lucky, because I made a lot of bad decisions, but those decisions didn't have lifelong consequences. Ali made a decision, and he went to Afghanistan because his older brother, and in the Arab culture, when your older brother tells you to do something, especially in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, it's a very different culture than here. America's very individualistic, and very kind of all about yourself and your personal journey, rather than the community and the family. And so when his brother told him to do this, there was no question that he was going to do that. But Ali never really wanted to join this group. But I think for me, I was lucky, because I made a lot of decisions that didn't have lifelong consequences. Ali made a decision that basically meant that from 16 to 32, the most formative years in a young man's life, he was taken out of the world. Not in prison, out of the world. Like in prison, you have TV and your family can visit and things like this. But one thing I love about that scene when, Abu Ghanem and all the rest of the guys are coming into the airport, their family has not seen them and touched them in a decade and a half. Imagine not seeing your mother, your father, your siblings for a decade and a half. It's different than prison. Guantanamo is not prison. Guantanamo is like going to an underworld where you're just cut off. They didn't know what Google was. Google. And Google has a lot of money for ads, but none of them made it to Guantanamo. So, yeah. All the way in the back, who's doing this? Yes, you. You just turned around.
Oh, yeah, so I thought the film was great and really amazing job. And I had 2 questions. The first is, do you have any updates on these men since you stopped filming? And the second question is, do you think the head or one of the leaders of the rehab center who you interviewed towards the end, do you think he was actually potentially in fear of his life when it came to like answering your question? And that's why he said like there are things happening behind the scenes you don't understand.
Yeah, so I'll take those in reverse. The first one, I will say that like, I don't know if you watch a lot of documentaries, but there's been a plethora of documentaries done on Saudi Arabia, and there's 2 kinds of documentaries that are made out of Saudi Arabia. Ones that say Saudi Arabia is the best place in the world and never do anything wrong, i.e. propaganda. The others are ones that just say this is the worst place in the world, everyone's corrupt, this is horrible, the people are horrible. There's very, very kind of polaristic views that really aren't nuanced. And so with this film, one thing that I try to do is just not even balance, but just be honest and truthful. Saudi Arabia is like most other countries in the world in that it is not all bad and it's not all good. They do some good things, they do some bad things. And when it comes to that specific interview, when you watch like frontline documentaries about Saudi Arabia, you'll see a government official and he'll be talking and being grilled by the journalist. And everything around, and he toes the party line, he'll say what he needs to say, just like Dr. Hamid did. Dr. Hamid said exactly what he should have said as a representative, there we go, of the Saudi government, right? And if you watch these frontline documentaries, you know, they don't make Saudi Arabia look good. They go way harder in the paint than this film does. And in that same theory, the guy who answered those questions should be in jail. But because he told the party line, he's not responsible for the rest of the film. Now, if that guy, that Saudi official, was seen as having any kind of editorial say in the making of the film, or any kind of like story input, that changes the game. And that's why when you make a film like this, you have to keep a firewall between you and the editing process and the subjects or the interviewees of your film, so it doesn't appear at all that they had any say whatsoever in how the film came out. But he did exactly what he was supposed to do for his job, and he said exactly what the government would want him to say. So no is, I guess, the quick answer to that question. Oh yeah, so a really quick update. Ali has a second kid now, a girl, and he's absolutely loving being a father. He's really come into his own. He's really kind of just found himself and become I don't know, I think having kids for him really kind of gave him that sense of purpose and that sense of being and that sense of like family again. And unfortunately, Muhammad's dad died of COVID-19 during the pandemic, and he's kind of been having a rough go of it since. And Nader, who is a huge football fan, unfortunately still is not married and no job, and yeah, unfortunately. So what's that? Well, we're gonna keep on going on this. They're gonna kick it. They're kicking us out here.
Yeah, we're getting the signal from the back of the room.
I will be up in the lobby, and if you guys have more questions, you can come get me up there. But they're gonna kick us out right now, so we'll go. Oh yeah, if you guys want to, one thing I will ask, one more favor I'll ask, is you guys are some of the very few people who've actually seen this film. And so if you saw it and you feel compelled, please go on Twitter or your blogs or social media and write about like what you saw in the film and what you think about it. And that would be super helpful. And if you know any Academy members, please tell them to watch the film.
That's very important. Hey, let's have a big hand for Meg, please.